Hey Lake Point, Pastor Michael here with a recap of the second week of our STEP series. Last week, Pastor Zach introduced us to Step 1, in which we admitted we were powerless over our deepest problems and that our lives had become unmanageable. He shared how our personal inadequacy often gets in the way of our best intentions. I should work out and get in shape, but I'm tired. I should get my finances in order, but I like to shop too much. I shouldn't have another drink, but I had a stressful day. I shouldn't watch that, but I just can't help myself. That little phrase, but I, so often gets in the way of us living our best lives. And that phrase shows up over and over again in Scripture when God calls someone to do something great. Over and over, we see the same excuse, but I. And here's the thing, God never disagrees with the statements. He never says, no, that's not true, Moses, you're actually a pretty good speaker, or actually, Abraham, you're not that old. That's the way that we respond. We tend to disregard people's inadequacies and seek to affirm them by saying things like, no, you're amazing, you can do it. But the writers of Scripture, they don't. Look at what the Apostle Paul says to the people in Corinth. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 26. Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many of you were of noble birth. Paul actually invites them to review their list of personal inadequacies. Wise? No. Influential? No. Come from a good gene pool? No. And Paul is remarkably untroubled by this. Look at what he writes next. He says, but God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of the world and the despised things to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. But God. Paul says your personal inadequacy does not get the last word on who you can be or what you can do. That phrase, but God, is used dozens of times in the Bible. Joseph said to his brothers who sold him into slavery, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. The psalmist said, my flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. Jesus said, human speaking, it is impossible, but with God, everything is possible. Earl Palmer taught that these two words summarize the whole message of Scripture, the heart of the gospel. We disobeyed, but God. We sinned, but God. We rebelled, but God. We wandered away, but God. Human history, human problems, human destiny would be a one-way track to trouble and death if it weren't for but God. It's what makes Step 2 so hope-filled. Whereas Step 1 is all about recognizing the problem, I can't. Step 2 is embracing the solution, He can. More specifically, Step 2 is that we come to believe that a greater power greater than ourselves can restore us to sanity. Do you believe in a power greater than yourself? As Pastor Nate shared, the encouraging thing is that you only need a little bit of faith to get you going on Step 2. Consider the story of Abraham, who is the father of our faith. We read about him in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. Hebrews 11, which lists the Hall of Fame of the heroes of our faith, devotes more space to Abraham than to anyone else other than maybe Moses. Listen to what it says. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. Those 4 verses make it sound as if Abraham possessed this world-class faith, but the reality is, like us, his faith often wandered. It wavered. Consider not what we read about him in the New Testament, but in the Old Testament. His story spans 14 chapters in Genesis, and those 400 verses reveal how human he really was. His story begins in Genesis 12, where we read that the Lord had said to Abraham, go from your country, your people, and your father's household in the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. And so, by faith, Abraham obeyed, sort of. We read in the next verse that Abraham went as the Lord had told him to, but that he brought his nephew Lot with him. Now, Lot was a part of the household he was supposed to leave behind. And so, why did Abraham bring him? It was simple. Abraham was 75 years old and without children. So Lot was his insurance policy. It was his plan B. However, in chapter 13, we read that Lot leaves Abraham, which means plan B is out, and Abraham was still childless. So in chapter 15, Abraham informs God, "You have given me no children, so a servant in my household, Eliezer, will be my heir," aka Eliezer is plan C. God, however, clarifies. Look at what he says. He says, "This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir." He took him outside and said, "Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them." And he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." Abram believed the Lord, and he credited him as righteousness, or at least sort of. More time goes by. Now Abraham's wife Sarah is 75, and so in Genesis 16, she and Abraham devise a plan to have a son through her servant Hagar. Baby Ishmael becomes plan D. However, plan D turns out to be a big problem. Eventually, God returns to clarify further that Abraham will have a biological son by Sarah. Abraham is so filled with doubt, he actually laughs under his breath at the thought. I mean, listen to what he says. He says, "Abraham fell face down. He laughed and said to himself, 'Will a son be born to a man 100 years old?' But God assures him it will be. And so it all comes true. Abraham finally gets it right. Except for where he doesn't. In a little noted postscript, after Sarah dies and grown up, Isaac marries Rebekah and goes 20 years without any children, and so Abraham marries again, and he and his new wife, Keturah, have not one, not two, but 6 children, all boys, plan E, F, G, H, and I. It's not until Isaac and Rebekah finally have twin boys, Jacob and Esau, and those boys are actually old enough to reproduce, that Abraham is convinced that this great nation is going to come from him and Sarah. And so he gives his 6 youngest sons parting gifts and names Isaac his heir to establish the patriarchal line. In other words, to the very near end of his life, Abraham was still making backup plans in case God bit off more than he could chew. So how much faith did he have? Well, apparently not enough to be certain, not enough to avoid some mistakes, just enough to interact with God. Enough faith to leave when God said leave, enough faith to course correct when he made a mistake, enough faith to pray and listen and respond, enough faith to maybe not give up. And apparently that faith was good enough for God to work with. In fact, Abraham was called a friend of God, James 2, chapter 2, verse 23, not because he believed with certainty, but because he persisted in ambiguity. Sometimes religious people confuse faith with certainty, but at least in this story, God didn't get that memo. God could have told Abraham at their first meeting that the promise would take 25 years to be fulfilled, but God didn't. Instead, God was deliberately, repeatedly ambiguous with Abraham. Why? Because God was growing and stretching Abraham's faith one little step at a time. You see, faith is a process, not a pronouncement. Faith is a step-by-step process rather than this big, bold announcement. It's how it works in AA. A person comes physically to a meeting. As they sit around the circle, they listen and hear stories from people who used to be drunks who are now sober, people who used to be addicts who are now clean. And what happens is they come to. They have a moment of realization, a moment of awareness. I have a problem. I'm stuck and I can't fix it. But as they listen to stories of transformation, they start to experience hope and they come to believe. Not this feeling of certainty that everything's going to be okay, or yes, Jesus rose from the dead, but that maybe this higher power can heal them as he's done for others, that he could restore their sanity. And so they come to believe in this hope, this power greater than themselves to do what they cannot do. How much belief? How much faith? Often not a ton, just enough to keep coming back and begin working the steps. As Nate shared, the same is true for all of us. Our faith journey is no different. First, we came to church or a small group or the Bible or a prayer with all of our doubt and uncertainties. And second, we came to an awareness of our personal inadequacy and need for God. And finally, we came to believe that God can save us. Well, friends, that's it for now. Thanks for listening. Enjoy jumping discussion questions. I'll see you next time.